investigation, we strongly feel this individual has been involved in other homicides. We have taken evidence out of the building to be examined.
Why Jeffrey Dahmer's inmate killed him. The dust had settled in
The fact that he murdered a bunch of people. We'll
one
see.
of the most gut-wrenching cases in America. That was the moment the infamous Milwaukee cannibal, Jeffrey Dahmer, was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences, February of 1992. He was locked up in the Columbia Correctional Institute. The victims and their families could at least take some form of respite, knowing that he'd suffer for long. Or so they thought. Just over 2 years into his sentence, on the morning of the 28th of November 1998, Dahmer and 2 other inmates walked into the toilet block for cleaning duties. Dahmer and one of the other inmates never walked out. What had just happened here, and who was the third inmate, who walked out undetected by the guards? Backstory. To have been convicted of 15 counts of first-degree murder and receive a sentence of over 900 years in prison, can only imagine the things Jeffrey Dahmer must have done. If there's one thing
900
you can
years
be
in
sure of
prison.
sometimes when the law is involved, it's that the consequence is usually commensurate with the crime, and you'll find that in Jeffrey's case as well. Dahmer committed his first murder when he was 18. He had been driving when 19-year-old Stephen Hicks, who was heading to a rock concert at Chippewa Lake Park, Ohio, decided to hitchhike with him. As they drove, Jeffrey brought up the idea of Stephen going with him to his house to have a few drinks. After drinking, Stephen told Jeffrey that he wanted to leave, but Jeffrey didn't want him to. It turned out that Jeffrey was hoping he would act on his feelings for Stephen. Seeing as he couldn't stop Stephen from leaving, Jeffrey used a 10-pound dumbbell to strike Stephen twice on the back of the head. As soon as Stephen passed out, Jeffrey used the bar of the dumbbell to strangle him. The next day, Jeffrey dismembered Stephen's corpse
Jesus
and buried the parts
Christ.
of his body in his backyard. But because he didn't want to leave the evidence behind, he dug up Stephen's body weeks after, peeled the flesh off the bones, and dissolved it in acid. He then flushed the output down the toilet before crushing the bones with a sledgehammer and spreading them around his backyard like mulch. After Jeffrey killed Stephen, he went on to kill his next 4 victims: 25-year-old Stephen Tuomi, 14-year-old James Doxtator, 22-year-old Richard Guerrero, and 24-year-old Anthony Sears. This was between 1987 and 1988. In the years of 1989 and 1991, Jeffrey met and murdered his remaining 12 victims, and his last
Jesus.
victim was 25-year-old Joseph Brederhoft. Jeffrey's MO for all of his victims were in this order: strangulation, dismemberment, and decapitation. But as they say, everything comes to an end. In Jeffrey's case, he just wasn't expecting it. His arrest and trial. To get rid of the dead bodies in his apartment, Jeffrey bought a large tank, filled it with acid, and threw the torsos of his victims into it. He also cooked the dismembered body parts and constantly ate them, hence the alias Milwaukee Cannibal. A few years into Jeffrey's crime spree, a man named Tracy Edwards came dangerously close to becoming one of his many victims, save for the fact that he followed his instincts. Tracy and Jeffrey met in July of 1991, and as usual, Jeffrey convinced Tracy to follow him to his apartment. Tracy said that when he got there, he sensed that something was off. He was fortunate enough to get out of the apartment and run for dear life. While running down the street, he stopped a police car and told the police officer how he felt something wasn't right about Jeffrey. This incident marked the beginning of the end for the 31-year-old killer. The police officer Tracy spoke to called for backup, and together with other cops who responded to his call, he raided Jeffrey's apartment. To their sheer horror, the authorities found several pictures of dismembered body parts all over the apartment. About 4 or 5 decapitated
Keeping
heads
it
in
classy,
Jeffrey's freezer,
Jeffrey.
and dismembered body parts in both pots and pans. They also found in the large tank the torsos Jeffrey had dissolved using acid. Jeffrey was immediately arrested and taken into police custody. His day of reckoning had come, but things would only get worse for him from then on. After 6 weeks of being in police custody, Dahmer finally confessed to his crimes via pages of writing. During his trial, he pled guilty by reason of insanity, but he was deemed legally sane at his trial. At the end of his largely publicized trial on February 17th, 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was convicted of 15 murders, life behind bars. The nature of Jeffrey's crimes placed him in people's bad books. As a result, he was placed in protective custody and held in isolation. In the same vein, he was never let out of his cell except when he was bound. After a year of being held in the isolation cell, Jeffrey appealed to prison officials to move him to a different unit, stating that he had been cooperative and never caused any trouble. His appeal was heard, and he was moved to a unit for inmates with emotional and mental challenges. In this unit, Jeffrey was able to relate with other inmates. He started attending classes and even signed up for work duties. Along the line, Dahmer met a prison minister, Roy Ratcliffe, whom he reportedly often shared remorseful remarks about the murders he had committed with. Around this time, Jeffrey also started going to chapel. In May of 1994,
Oh,
Jeffrey
yeah.
sought to be baptized, and he was
Wasn't it the same day that he was baptized? John Wayne Gacy was
Baptized by
put to death by lethal
After
injection.
his baptism, he began to share with other inmates the correspondences he'd been getting concerning his newfound faith. According to several reports, it was during this time that Jeffrey began to display certain behaviors that other inmates didn't appreciate. He often made jokes about cannibalism, saying that he was going to bite them. Dahmer also had a knack for molding his food to look like dismembered body parts. As if that wasn't bad enough, he would proceed to cover the food with ketchup to complete the look. While some reports say he ate the food afterwards, others say Jeffrey left these rather disturbing pieces of food art lying around for the other inmates to find. Whatever the case, the inmates didn't like this sick game Dahmer was playing, but there was a particular inmate who took his dislike to the extreme, and this inmate was none other than Christopher Scarver. Christopher Scarver. Scarver was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, just like Jeffrey. After he dropped out of high school and got kicked out of the house by his mother, he joined a youth conservation corps program, where he secured a position as a trainee carpenter. During the program, a supervisor reportedly told Scarver that he was sure to become a full-time employee as soon as he completed the program. However, that did not happen. So, on June 1st, 1990, an angry Scarver made his way to the office of the training program, declaring that the program owed him money. One of the people he happened to meet that day was his former boss, Stephen Lohman. When he asked Stephen for his money, Scarver said that Stephen gave him $15.
What?
This reportedly provoked Scarver to the point that he shot Stephen in the head. After Scarver fired the first shot at Stephen, he went out of control and ended up shooting the wounded man 3 more times. Still armed with a murder weapon, Scarver demanded that the manager write him a check for $3,000. He then proceeded to steal the manager's credit card before heading to his pregnant girlfriend's apartment. The police found Scarver outside his girlfriend's apartment hours later, and since
I'm not saying you should go around shooting guys in the head, but as a boss, you should pay your fucking employees. Or disgruntled employee might come and fucking shoot you in the head.
His girlfriend
was pregnant, probably needs to provide.
Crimes in 1992, the same as Jeffrey. But according to Scarver, despite the few similarities that they shared, he stayed away from Jeffrey while in prison. Aside from the fact that Scarver didn't like Jeffrey due to the gruesomeness of his crimes, he also didn't like how he was usually causing trouble. While speaking on the issue, Scarver pointed out that many of the other inmates shared his sentiment, and he even recalled how a fellow inmate, Osvaldo Dorothy, had attempted to cut Jeffrey's throat with a razor he hid inside a toothbrush. Despite his obvious dislike for the serial killer, Scarver pretty much didn't mind Jeffrey and did his best to stay away from him up until 1994. What changed, you ask? You're about to find out. On November 28th, 1994, Scarver, Jeffrey, and another inmate, Jesse Anderson, had been assigned to clean the bathrooms in the prison's gym. Scarver said that while they were cleaning, someone poked him at the back, and when he turned to look, he found both Jeffrey and Jesse laughing under their breath. Although this greatly angered Scarver, he didn't do anything and decided to wait until Jeffrey went to the locker room. Moments later, Scarver removed a metal bar from a piece of exercise equipment in the prison weight room and followed Jeffrey into the locker room. In the locker room, Scarver bludgeoned 34-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer to the brink of death. He then went after Jesse and did the same to him. Jeffrey died as he was being rushed to the hospital, while Jesse died 2 days later. When Scarver was asked why he did what he did, he claimed that he was the chosen one and that he had to do it. Scarver also claimed that the correctional officers knew that he didn't like Jeffrey and that they intentionally had them work together so that he could kill Dahmer. Of course, there is no proof to back up these outrageous claims. Regardless of whether or not the correctional officers intentionally set the pair up, the deed was done, and Jeffrey Dahmer had died after serving 3 years of what was supposed to be a life sentence. Following the brutal murders, Scarver was catapulted into the spotlight as he received a lot of commendations and backlash from the general public. While some people said he was still a criminal, a greater number applauded him for getting rid of Jeffrey Dahmer, whom
Jesus
they always thought
Christ.
deserved to die. Some accounts even state that Scarver received thank you notes from the families of some of Jeffrey's victims. The aftermath. While the court of public opinion did its thing, the truth remained that Scarver had committed cold-blooded murder and needed to be punished for his crimes. The case was brought before a court of law, and in addition to the life sentence Scarver was already serving, he was given 2 more life sentences. Scarver is still alive today. He's currently in a medium-security prison in Wisconsin, where he self-publishes poetry. He has been spending his free time writing songs, music compositions, short stories, poetry, and prison policy proposals, as well as creating original art, according to his Amazon bio. Currently, Scarver has multiple poetry books for sale, including 2015's The Child Left Behind, and has managed to remain in contact with his son through it all. The two have reportedly maintained a good relationship all these years. In addition to being a published writer, Scarver also wishes to attend college to study mechanical and electrical engineering through his American Prisoner Repatriation Act initiative. Needless to say, Scarver is dedicated to making the most out of life, despite being confined to a prison cell.
It's not easy butchering people. It's hard work. Physically and mentally, I don't think people realize you need to vent.
You need to vent.
you know, there's a lot more like me.
Do you think so?
Serial killers don't always come off as scary boogeymen with bloodshot eyes wielding an axe. Most times, they're just regular people with dark, twisted minds who not only kill their victims, but also enjoy torturing them and abusing them before, and sometimes even after killing them. Here are America's most wanted serial killers in history, H.H. Holmes. Herman Mudgett, also known as H.H. Holmes, is the first documented serial killer in America. He was born into a wealthy family in 1861 and developed an interest in medicine as a young child. He would trap animals and perform surgeries on them. Some accounts claim he also murdered one of his playmates. In 1886, Mudgett took a job as a pharmacist in Chicago under the name Dr. H.H. Holmes. He built a house called the Murder Castle and started killing people to steal their property. His Murder Castle was a specially designed death dungeon where he committed his crimes. It had secret passages, trapdoors, soundproof rooms, and doors that could be locked from the outside to ensure his victims never escaped. It also had gas tanks to asphyxiate them and a kiln to burn the bodies. He would seduce women, get engaged to them, and convince them to put their life savings in his control. He would then kill them and sometimes sell their bodies to local medical schools. Mudgett confessed to 27 murders, but later increased the number to over 130. However, most researchers believe he murdered over 200. He was arrested in 1894 in Boston, Massachusetts, and sentenced to death by hanging. He was later hanged in the Philadelphia County Prison. Dennis Rader.
I actually think of maybe
Dennis Rader. Oh, BTS.
Dennis Rader, also known as BTK, the
BTK
Killer, or
BTK.
the BTK Strangler, a name he gave himself as an abbreviation of Bind, Torture, Kill, was a serial killer that terrorized Wichita and Park City, Kansas for decades. Rader grew up with 4 brothers and 2 parents who were always too busy to pay attention to their kids. From a young age, he had sexual fantasies of torturing trapped and helpless women. He also trapped, tortured, hanged, and killed small animals. Rader killed 10 people between 1974 and 1991 by stalking his victims, breaking into their homes, and strangling them. After that, he would send taunting letters to the police, which he signed as BTK. He would also take pictures wearing female clothing while bound, which he later confessed he did to emulate his victims. He disappeared around 1988, only to reappear 7 years later. This time, he had been elected president of a church council and was a Cub Scout member, but he was still involved in his criminal lifestyle, this time sending a floppy disk to the police rather than his usual letters. This floppy disk became his undoing. It didn't take long for the police to trace it back to him. He was arrested immediately, after which he confessed to 10 murders. He currently serves 10 consecutive life sentences at the El Dorado Correctional Facility. Charles Ray Hatcher. Charles Ray Hatcher was a serial killer and child molester who confessed to murdering 16 people between 1969 and 1982.
Holy shit.
Born in Mound City, Missouri, Hatcher's father was an abusive alcoholic. His childhood was relatively uneventful, but he had several run-ins with the law from a young age. At the age of 6, he watched his older brother die from electric shock while they were outside flying a kite. As he grew older, he started engaging in crimes ranging from auto theft to attempted burglary. He would later commit other murders while carrying on his seemingly everyday life. His victims included women and minors, who he would abduct, rape, and kill, and then dump their bodies in a shallow grave or river. After an innocent man was imprisoned for the murder of one of Hatcher's victims, he came forward with his confession. Of the 16 murders he confessed to, he was only charged with 2. Hatcher was sentenced to life imprisonment with no parole for at least 50 years. He requested a death sentence, but the prosecutors recommended a life term. 4 days later, he hanged himself in his prison cell at the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City. Randall Woodfield.
Turn out to be one of the most prolific serial killers that we have ever known.
Randall Woodfield, also known as the I-5 Killer or the I-5 Bandit, is a serial killer, rapist, kidnapper, and robber who got his nickname from a series of crimes he committed on the Interstate 5 corridor through Washington, Oregon, and California. Woodfield played football professionally for the Portland State Vikings and later for the Green Bay Packers, but he lost his position on the team due to a series of improper exposure arrests. Woodfield then switched to murdering people. His victims were women whom he would threaten with a knife.
So you're telling me that there was a serial killer a part of the Green Bay Packers?
Assault and then kill. He never confessed to any crime, and he was only convicted of 1 murder and 1 attempted murder.
I think after this video is bedtime, I'm tired.
Convicted for the murder of Shari Hull and the attempted murder of Beth Wilmot. He was also convicted of sodomy and improper use of a weapon in a sexual assault case, for which he got 35 years in prison. For his other 2 crimes, he is currently serving a life sentence and a 90-year sentence at the Oregon State Penitentiary. Edmund Kemper.
I am an American, and I killed Americans. I am a human being, and I killed human beings. and I did it in my society.
The co-ed killer, Edmund Kemper, is a serial killer and necrophile responsible for several gruesome murders in the 1960s and 1970s. From a young age, he showed signs of being a mentally disturbed individual. He killed animals, decapitated his sister's dolls, and invented strange games with his playmates. His first victims were his grandparents, whom he murdered when he was only 15. His later victims included 6 female hitchhikers in Santa Cruz.
15? Damn.
Raped their corpses, dismembered
Starting
them,
early.
and buried their heads in his backyard. He then killed his mother and one of her friends, but surprisingly turned himself in to the police. He was found guilty of 8 counts of murder. Perhaps he had turned himself in so he could bargain with the court to give him the death sentence rather than life imprisonment. But the court refused his request and handed him a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Donald Harvey.
Surprised that the rat poison had worked so fast. And he turned blue within 5 or 10 minutes. He was already gone.
Donald Harvey took advantage of his work as a hospital orderly to commit several murders between 1970 and 1987. He started working in hospitals at age 18. His victims were usually cardiac patients. He claimed that he killed them out of empathy for their suffering, and sometimes because he was angry with them. But he later confessed to enjoying the murders, describing himself as the Angel of Death. Harvey claimed to have murdered 87 people, but official estimates place his body count between 37 and 57 victims. He usually smothered his victims with their pillows, and he was never investigated because the police paid more attention to the nurses and doctors than the orderlies. But when an autopsy revealed that one of his victims, who had spent several months on life support following a motorcycle accident, had died of cyanide poisoning, when the police questioned him, he confessed to the murder and as many as 50 other murders. He pled guilty to 37 murders and was serving 28 life sentences at the Toledo Correctional Institution before a fellow inmate beat him mercilessly. On March 28, 2017, he died from his injuries 2 days later. The Zodiac. The Zodiac Killer, also known as the Zodiac, was a serial killer that terrorized urban and suburban neighborhoods in North California in the 1960s and 1970s. Although some of his victims survived and provided descriptions of him, the police could never match his profile or DNA with any of the suspects. His case is one of the most famous unsolved murder cases of the 20th century. It gathered wide media attention because of several letters the killer sent to the press while active. In his letters, he confessed to 37 murders, but only 5 of them were verified out of 7 known victims. The other 2 survived his attacks. Zodiac usually targeted lone couples at night. He would point a flashlight into their eyes to blind them from seeing him, then open fire on them until he was sure they were dead. One time, he sent a swatch of his victim's blood-stained shirt to the press as proof that he was responsible for the attack. There were some suspects and some people who confessed they were the Zodiac, but none of them checked out. The Zodiac's identity has never been uncovered. John Wayne Gacy.
The way I've described the rope trick is it's nothing more than a tourniquet. And I had explained it to them. I even demonstrated it to them. We cut off the air. So if you're going to kill somebody, you just put it on their neck and twist it 3 times or 4 times or whatever till the person stops moving.
In the daytime, John Wayne Gacy was at children's hospitals and charitable events performing as Pogo the Clown, or Patches the Clown. But at night, he would rape, torture, and murder young boys. He had at least 33 victims, and his disguise earned him the nickname Killer Clown. Gacy lived with his parents and 2 sisters as a child. While he was close to his siblings and mother, his father physically abused his family. He was especially mean to John Wayne, whom he was fond of calling dumb and stupid, while comparing him with his sisters. Gacy lived in a ranch-style house near Norwich, where he performed the horrific acts. He would lure a young boy inside his home and make him wear handcuffs under the pretense of demonstrating a magic trick. He then raped and tortured them, then killed them by asphyxiation or strangulation with a garrote. He buried 25 victims in his home and threw 4 inside the Des Plaines River. After being convicted of 33 murders, he was sentenced to death by lethal injection in March 1980. He spent his time on death row at Stateville Correctional Center, painting, before being executed in 1994. Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer not only killed his victims, he also dismembered their bodies and kept some parts in his house as gruesome trophies, while eating some and leaving some in a big chemical-filled keg to decompose. The media dubbed him the Milwaukee Cannibal, or the Milwaukee Monster. Dahmer grew up with a father who was always away from home, and a mother who was bedridden for most of her life. Consequently, he was often abandoned. As a child, he was fascinated by dead animals and how to preserve their bodies. He soon started experimenting with human beings, fulfilling his sexual fantasies of having intercourse with a submissive male partner. Dahmer confessed to 17 murders, starting from 1978. He was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and psychotic disorder. So he pled not guilty by reason of insanity to minimize his punishment. But the jury
That's what I'm wondering, Dev.
sentenced him to 15 life terms,
Oh.
which was later increased to 16. A fellow inmate eventually killed
Told
him
people
and
to
beat him
drop
to
some
death
shit in.
1994. Ted Bundy.
People want with me, going beyond retribution and punishment, because there is no way in the world that killing me is going to restore those beautiful children to their parents and correct and soothe the pain.
Ted Bundy was a serial killer who triggered a wave of panic among young women in the 1970s. His case is particularly interesting because
Hell
he
yeah,
followed just
dude.
about
Getting them
everyone
jobs. I
with
seen it on
charming
chat,
looks and calm
Snapchat there.
demeanor. On the outside, he was an intelligent law student, diligently pursuing his degree. On the inside, he was, as he once described himself, the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet.
Absolutely horrified that I was capable of doing something like that.
After gaining his victims'
You got any
trust, he would
videos you
strike
wanna
them
watch before I get
unconscious
off,
and take
Dev?
them to a second location where he would rape and strangle them. He continued raping their corpses until they were so decomposed that he was
fuck?
unable to continue. After nearly a decade of denials, he finally confessed to 30 murders. Expected his body count was actually much higher. While facing murder charges, he escaped prison twice before he was recaptured and handed 3 death sentences. On January 29th, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed at the Florida State Prison. Serial killers often have a history of abuse.
Yeah, dude, I'm tired. I'm running out of fumes. I'm running out of fumes.
Minds possible, enjoying their victims' pain. The killers on this list certainly had no regard for human life.
No, they do not.
People don't realize that there is no people like love, lived with, worked with, and admired. The next day turn out to be the most demonic people imaginable.
Jesus. Thanks, Ted, for that tidbit of information.